The catered lunch spread looked impressive, even by the standards of the Innovate Solutions boardroom. Tiny quiches, artisanal sandwiches, glistening fruit tarts. But the conversation curdled the expensive coffee I was nursing. My husband, Mark, VP of Marketing and currently holding court, gestured towards me with a dismissive flick of his wrist as he spoke to a visiting client, Mr. Henderson. "And this lovely lady is my wife, Alina," he announced, his voice booming with practiced charm. "Keeps the home fires burning while I'm out conquering the tech world. Mostly focuses on, well, looking good, right, darling?" He winked at me, expecting a demure smile in return. Henderson chuckled politely, clearly uncomfortable. Mark's own team members exchanged awkward glances but said nothing. Heat rushed to my cheeks, a familiar burn of humiliation I'd learned to swallow over our 6 years of marriage. Just a pretty face. He hadn't used those exact words this time, but the implication hung heavy and poisonous in the air-conditioned room. It was his standard line when introducing me in professional settings. A subtle diminishment disguised as a compliment, designed to keep me firmly in the box labeled supportive spouse, separate from the serious world of business he inhabited. "My name is Alina Vance," and while Mark was busy implying my main function was ornamental, the reality was slightly different. I wasn't just Alina Vance, Mark's wife. I was E. Vance, the founder and majority shareholder of Innovate Solutions, the very company paying for this catered lunch, the company whose strategic direction I guided anonymously through a trusted board and layers of corporate structuring. Mark, like nearly everyone else here, had absolutely no idea. He thought he worked for a reclusive, eccentric tech mogul who communicated only through encrypted channels and a designated intermediary. He had no clue that the home fires I kept burning involved reviewing quarterly reports, approving budgets, and making final decisions on the very projects he bragged about leading. The sting of his casual dismissal was sharp, a fresh wound layered onto years of similar microaggressions. But beneath the hurt, a cold resolve began to solidify. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about the culture he was fostering within my company. The way his team members looked away, unwilling to challenge his casual sexism, told me everything I needed to know. His attitude wasn't just personally insulting. It was professionally corrosive. I forced a tight smile. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice smooth and even, deliberately ignoring Mark. "It's a pleasure. I hope my husband's team is providing everything you need for a successful partnership." Henderson looked relieved to be addressed directly, professionally. Mark's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by my interjection. He quickly recovered, launching back into his pitch, but the seed was planted. He thought he was the conqueror. He had no idea he was merely a jester in my court, and his performance was rapidly losing its appeal. The immediate aftermath of Mark's comment was a familiar internal storm masked by outward calm. As the meeting continued, his voice droning on about market share and synergy, I retreated into myself. The elegant boardroom felt like a cage, the polite smiles of his colleagues like bars. I felt utterly alone, isolated not by physical distance, but by the secret I carried. Mark believed I was just his wife, someone whose primary concerns revolved around dinner parties and decorating our penthouse apartment, an apartment ironically owned by one of my holding companies and leased back to us at a rate Mark thought was exorbitant but was actually significantly below market value. This secrecy had started as a defense mechanism. Years ago, Before Mark, a disastrous relationship with a charismatic entrepreneur had ended with him attempting to leverage my connections and exploit my first successful startup. It taught me a brutal lesson. Some men saw successful women not as partners, but as opportunities. When I founded Innovate Solutions, I deliberately created distance, building a firewall between my personal life and my professional identity. Vance, the enigmatic founder, became my shield. It allowed me to observe, to guide, to build without the noise of personal bias or the threat of opportunistic suitors. Meeting Mark felt different initially. He was ambitious, yes, but seemed genuinely supportive of my supposed freelance consulting work. He celebrated my small wins, listened patiently to my frustrations. Marrying him felt like finding a safe harbor, but the harbor, I now realized, had treacherous undercurrents. His support had always been conditional, predicated on the assumption that his career, his world, was the dominant one. My successes were framed as hobbies, my insights dismissed unless they aligned with his own agenda. The pretty face comment wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of subtle dismissals, each one chipping away at the foundation of respect I thought we shared. After the clients left, Mark draped an arm around my shoulder. "You okay, honey? You seemed a little quiet during Henderson's presentation." The casual lack of awareness was staggering. "Just tired," I murmured, pulling away gently. "Big day of, well, keeping the home fires burning." He laughed, missing the sarcasm entirely. "That's my girl. Hey, I'm grabbing drinks with the team to celebrate closing the Henderson deal. Don't wait up." He kissed my cheek and strode off, radiating confidence, oblivious to the fact that I had personally approved the parameters of the Henderson deal weeks ago. After his initial proposal was deemed too risky by my intermediary, back in the silent penthouse, the stunning city views felt mocking. What good was all this, the success, the wealth, the power, if the person closest to me saw only a decorative accessory? I poured myself a glass of wine, the expensive label tasting like vinegar. I could confront him, reveal everything, watch his world shatter. The thought was tempting, a quick, satisfying release. But my years operating from the shadows had taught me patience, strategy. A dramatic explosion might feel good momentarily, but it rarely yielded the best long-term results. What did I really want? An apology, unlikely to be sincere. Revenge, too messy, too costly for the company. What I wanted was respect. I wanted the culture of my company to reflect the values I believed in: meritocracy, collaboration, mutual respect, not the casual sexism and ego-driven decision-making Mark seemed to be propagating. I needed to understand how deep his influence went. Who else shared his dismissive attitude? Revealing myself now would send shockwaves, making objective assessment impossible. No, I decided, swirling the wine in my glass, Vance would remain in the shadows a while longer, but Alina Vance, the underestimated wife, would start paying much closer attention. My decision required a shift in perspective, a new kind of journey. Instead of focusing on the pain of Mark's dismissal, I began to view my position as his wife as a unique vantage point, an undercover assignment within my own life, my mission to observe the inner workings of Innovate Solutions, not from the CEO's chair, but from the periphery, where people often reveal their true selves when they think no one important is watching. It was surprisingly easy. Mark loved hosting dinner parties for his team and their spouses, seeing it as essential for cultivating loyalty and providing opportunities for him to hold court. I'd always played the gracious hostess, ensuring everyone's glass was full. laughing politely at anecdotes I'd heard a dozen times. Now I listened differently. I observed the dynamics, who deferred to Mark unquestioningly, who subtly challenged him, whose eyes glazed over during his monologues, who treated me with genuine warmth versus condescending politeness. Sarah Peterson, head of product development, a brilliant woman Mark often described as a bit intense, consistently treated me as an equal, asking thoughtful questions about my supposed consulting work, genuinely interested in my opinions. In contrast, David Miller, Mark's second-in-command in marketing, barely acknowledged my presence beyond a cursory nod, mirroring Mark's dismissive attitude. These observations became data points. I started attending more company social functions, always on Mark's arm, the supportive wife. At the annual summer picnic, I circulated among the families, listening to casual conversations. It was illuminating. Complaints about Mark's management style, his tendency to take credit, his resistance to new ideas unless they were his own, were common among lower-level staff and their spouses. Yet, his direct reports seemed fiercely loyal, or perhaps just intimidated. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. The company culture I'd envisioned, innovative, collaborative, respectful, seemed to exist in pockets. But Mark's influence was creating a layer of executive arrogance that threatened to stifle it. My lowest point came during the company's charity golf tournament. Mark insisted I ride along in his cart, primarily, I suspected, so he could show off his pretty wife to the visiting executives from a potential acquisition target. While Mark schmoozed on the fairway, I sat under the clubhouse awning, feeling like a prop. I overheard two junior executives from the visiting company discussing the potential merger. "Vance runs a tight ship, apparently," one said. "Never seen, only communicates through channels. Weird." The other laughed. "Maybe it's a woman using a male initial, hiding from the old boys club." The comment stung, hitting closer to home than they knew. Was that all I was doing? Hiding? Had my strategy, born of self-protection, inadvertently created a vacuum filled by men like Mark, sitting there, surrounded by the trappings of success, the exclusive golf course, the perfectly manicured greens, the casual display of wealth? I felt profoundly disconnected and powerless, despite owning the very company facilitating this event. The feeling of being an outsider in my own life was becoming unbearable. Was this carefully constructed anonymity worth the emotional cost? The journey wasn't across continents, but through layers of my own carefully built defenses, forcing me to confront the limitations of the persona I had created. Just as doubt began to solidify into despair, an unexpected interaction shifted my perspective. It happened during a tedious company-sponsored team-building event. Mark had organized a catered affair at a downtown hotel ballroom. I was making polite small talk near the dessert table when a young woman approached me hesitantly. "Mrs. Vance, I'm Maya Sharma, from the Junior Analyst Program." I recognized her name. She was part of a pilot mentorship initiative I had secretly championed through the board, designed to fast-track diverse talent. "I just wanted to say," she continued, her voice earnest, "your husband mentioned you do some freelance consulting. I read an article about strategic market entry you supposedly helped him with. The insights were brilliant. It really inspired my approach to the Q3 projections." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. The article she mentioned was based on a detailed strategic analysis I had written and anonymously submitted through my intermediary channels. Mark had presented it as his own work, barely changing a word, but attributing the core concept vaguely to some external consultations his wife had helped facilitate. He'd likely assumed no one would pay attention to the details, or that I'd be flattered by the indirect mention. Hearing Maya's genuine appreciation for my work, even filtered through Mark's plagiarism, was a jolt. It reminded me that my ideas, my strategies, had value and impact, even when delivered anonymously. It wasn't just about Mark's betrayal. It was about reclaiming my own voice, my own contribution. Later that evening, another encounter solidified this shift. Thomas Ashton, the oldest member of the board and the only one who knew my true identity from the very beginning, my father's former business partner and my mentor, sought me out. He found me on the ballroom terrace, looking out at the city lights. "Difficult evening, Alina?" he asked quietly, his usual shrewd gaze softened with concern. I confessed my frustrations, the growing unease with Mark's leadership, the sting of his public dismissals, the limitations of my hidden role. Thomas listened patiently, swirling the brandy in his snifter. Anonymity served its purpose. "My dear," he said finally, "it protected you while you built this. But perhaps its season is ending. Innovate Solutions is strong now, your position secure. The question isn't whether the company needs E. Vance to remain a mystery, but whether Alina Vance needs to step into the light." He leaned against the railing beside me. "Mark's behavior is concerning, not just personally, but professionally. His team's performance metrics are slipping, overshadowed by flashy presentations that lack substance. There are whispers about questionable expense reports. The board is growing restless, Alina. They trust E. Vance implicitly, but they are beginning to question the judgment of her VP of marketing, who also happens to be her husband." His words were a confirmation and a call to action. My observations weren't just personal grievances. They reflected real business concerns. My secret wasn't just protecting me. It might be hindering the company. Thomas placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You built this company on integrity and innovation. Don't let one man's ego tarnish that. When you're ready, the board will support you. I will support you." His unwavering belief, combined with Maya's inadvertent validation, felt like finding solid ground after drifting at sea. I wasn't just Mark's wife. I wasn't just E. Vance. I was Alina Vance, founder, strategist, leader, and perhaps it was time everyone knew it. The decision to act wasn't instantaneous. It crystallized over weeks of careful observation and planning. Thomas Ashton became my silent co-conspirator, feeding me unfiltered board communications and internal reports that Mark likely assumed I never saw. The picture grew increasingly clear. Mark's division, despite its outward swagger, was underperforming. He excelled at marketing spin, but lacked strategic depth. His team, comprised mostly of loyalists, promoted for allegiance rather than merit, consistently missed targets, masking failures with inflated projections and creative accounting. David Miller, his right-hand man, seemed particularly adept at fudging numbers. Meanwhile, Sarah Peterson's product development team, operating with quiet competence, was generating most of the company's actual innovation and revenue growth, yet received minimal recognition from Mark. I started using my anonymous Evance channels more assertively. I questioned Mark's budget proposals through my board intermediary, demanding detailed justifications he struggled to provide. I greenlit pilot projects from Sarah's team that Mark had previously dismissed. I requested performance audits on divisions audits. Mark tried to delay or control. He began complaining at home about bureaucratic interference and the invisible hand of the mysterious CEO meddling in his affairs. "This Evance character is becoming a real pain," he grumbled one evening, pouring himself a large scotch. "Probably some old guy who's totally out of touch. Thinks he knows marketing better than I do." I merely nodded sympathetically, refilling his glass while mentally cross-referencing his complaints with the audit reports piling up in my secure digital files. The evidence of mismanagement, minor fraud, inflated expenses, questionable vendor choices, and a toxic bro culture within his division was becoming undeniable. My plan wasn't just about revealing my identity. It was about restructuring the company to realign with its core values. This required not just removing Mark, but also addressing the sycophants he'd promoted and empowering leaders like Sarah Peterson. I began working with Thomas and the board's compensation committee, again through anonymous channels, to draft a new organizational structure, one that prioritized performance and collaboration over personality and internal politics. Simultaneously, I engaged a top-tier forensic accounting firm, instructing them to conduct a deep dive into Mark's divisional spending and vendor contracts, reporting, directly to the board via Thomas. The net was tightening, strand by invisible strand. Mark seemed oblivious, his arrogance blinding him to the shifting currents. He grew more defensive at home, more prone to bragging about his indispensability at work, perhaps sensing his power waning but attributing it to the CEO's interference rather than his own failings. The catalyst for the final act came unexpectedly. Mark announced he'd landed a massive potential deal with Omnicorp, a major conglomerate. He presented it to the board via video conference, which I observed remotely as a game changer. His ticket to undisputed leadership. The projections were astronomical, the promises grand, but my own quiet due diligence revealed serious red flags. Omnicorp had a history of aggressive takeovers, and the deal structure Mark proposed gave them far too much leverage, potentially jeopardizing Innovate Solutions' independence. He hadn't done his homework. He'd been seduced by the prestige. I knew I had to intervene directly, decisively. The upcoming annual shareholder meeting, scheduled in 3 weeks, provided the perfect stage. Vance, the mysterious founder, would finally make a public appearance. The preparation for the shareholder meeting was intense. While Mark focused on polishing his Omnicorp presentation, convinced it would solidify his power, I worked with Thomas, the legal team, and the forensic accountants to assemble an irrefutable case detailing his mismanagement and the risks of the proposed deal. We prepared 2 scenarios, one where the board quietly removed Mark beforehand, and one involving a public revelation at the meeting itself. Thomas favored the latter. Sunlight, he argued, is the best disinfectant. Let the shareholders see exactly who you are and why changes are necessary. I agreed. A quiet removal would allow Mark to spin his own narrative. A public reckoning would leave no room for doubt. The forensic accounting report arrived 5 days before the meeting. It was worse than I'd suspected. Mark and David Miller hadn't just inflated expenses. They'd set up shell companies with preferred vendors, receiving kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. The total amount misappropriated was close to $500,000 over 3 years. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was outright fraud. Armed with this final piece of evidence, Thomas called an emergency closed session of the board, excluding Mark. I joined via secure video link, my face electronically obscured as usual. Thomas presented the findings. The board's reaction was swift and unanimous. Authorize Vance to take all necessary actions at the shareholder meeting. The night before the meeting, Mark was celebratory. He took me out to an expensive restaurant, bragging about the Omnicorp deal, painting himself as the company's savior. After tomorrow, Elena, he toasted, raising his champagne flute, everything changes. They'll finally have to recognize my value. I smiled, raising my water glass. I'm sure they will, Mark. He interpreted my smile as admiration. He couldn't see the steel beneath it. He spent the night in the guest room, claiming he needed to be sharp for his big presentation. I spent the night finalizing my own. The morning of the shareholder meeting dawned bright and clear. The convention center ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Financial analysts, major investors, and tech journalists filled the seats. Mark worked the room like a seasoned politician, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on the rumored Omnicorp deal. He blew me a kiss from across the room as I took my seat in the designated family section near the front, playing the role of the supportive wife one last time. Thomas Ashton opened the meeting with standard formalities before introducing the agenda. Item 3, Strategic Partnership Proposal. Mark Vance, VP Marketing. Item 4, Founders Address and Leadership Update. Vance. Mark shot me a triumphant look as his agenda item was announced. He strode to the podium, launching into his slick Omnicorp presentation. The slides were impressive, the rhetoric persuasive, but as he spoke, emails were discreetly delivered to every board member and major shareholder's device, a summary of the forensic accounting report. I watched from my seat as faces began to change, confusion turning to concern, then quiet outrage. Mark, caught up in his performance, didn't notice the shift in the room's energy until he reached his grand finale. And so, he concluded dramatically, I urge the board to approve this transformative partnership with Omnicorp. The expected applause was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Thomas Ashton returned to the podium. Thank you, Mark. Before the board addresses the Omnicorp proposal, we have our next agenda item. For the first time, please welcome the founder and majority shareholder of Innovate Solutions, Vance. All eyes turned towards the side entrance where I was expected to appear via video link on the large screens. Instead, I stood up from my seat in the front row. A ripple of confusion went through the audience. Mark stared, nonplussed. I walked calmly towards the stage, my heels clicking purposefully on the floor. Thomas Ashton met me at the steps, shaking my hand formally. Welcome, Ms. Vance. He stepped aside, leaving me alone at the podium. I adjusted the microphone, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the audience, finally landing on Mark. His face was utterly frozen, comprehension dawning in horrifying slow motion. Good morning, I began, my voice clear and steady. For those of you who don't know me, I am Elena Vance, founder, majority shareholder, and the guiding hand behind Innovate Solutions since its inception. Gasps rippled through the room. Mark looked like he'd been physically struck. For years, I continued, I chose to lead this company from behind the scenes, believing that results should speak louder than personalities. I entrusted day-to-day operations to a management team I thought shared my vision and values. It has become clear that trust was misplaced. I gestured towards Mark, who seemed rooted to the spot. My husband, Mark Vance, just presented a proposal with Omnicorp, a proposal based on inflated projections, inadequate due diligence, and a fundamental misunderstanding of our company's long-term strategic interests. A proposal the board will unanimously reject. Mark started to protest. but Thomas Ashton subtly signaled security, who moved closer. Furthermore, I went on, my voice hardening, a recent forensic audit, commissioned by the board, has uncovered significant financial irregularities within the marketing division, including fraudulent vendor contracts and misappropriation of funds, directly implicating Mr. Vance and his associate, David Miller. The room was completely silent now. Everyone stared at Mark, whose face had crumpled. Therefore, I concluded, my gaze locking with his, effective immediately. Mark Vance and David Miller are terminated from Innovate Solutions for cause. Investigations, both internal and potentially external, are ongoing. I looked out at the shareholders. Innovate Solutions was built on integrity. Today, we reaffirm that commitment. We will move forward under new leadership principles, focusing on transparency, collaboration, and genuine innovation. I nodded to Thomas, then turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind the wreckage of Mark's career and the stunned silence of the audience. I didn't look back. The applause started as I reached the exit, tentative at first, then growing into a wave of support. Elena Vance had finally stepped into the light. The fallout was swift and decisive. Security escorted Mark and David Miller from the premises before the shareholder meeting even concluded. The Omnicorp deal was officially dead on arrival. The forensic accounting report was handed over to the authorities, leading to investigations that would ultimately result in charges of fraud and embezzlement against both men. Mark's attempt to fight his termination dissolved quickly when faced with the irrefutable evidence. He tried reaching out, sending pleading texts and voicemails filled with disbelief and blame. I blocked his number, directing all communication through my divorce attorney. Our penthouse apartment, owned by my holding company, was swiftly vacated. His belongings were sent to his parents' house, the parents who had always subtly disapproved of me but were now horrified by their son's actions. The divorce was finalized efficiently. The prenuptial agreement, which Mark had insisted upon to protect his much smaller assets, ironically protected mine completely. He walked away with little more than his personal savings, his reputation in tatters. Innovate Solutions underwent a rapid transformation. Sarah Peterson was promoted to Chief Operating Officer, her competence finally recognized. We flattened the management structure, eliminated the toxic elements Mark had fostered, and implemented rigorous transparency protocols. Employee morale soared. The company, freed from the drag of Mark's mismanagement and fraudulent activities, entered a period of unprecedented growth and innovation. Clients responded positively to the changes, appreciating the renewed focus on integrity. Henderson, the client from that fateful boardroom lunch, became one of our most vocal advocates. Thomas Ashton remained my closest confidant and mentor on the board, his quiet wisdom invaluable as I navigated my new public role as CEO. Running the company openly felt like breathing fresh air after years underwater. There were challenges, of course, media scrutiny, adjustments to a public profile, but the sense of authenticity, of living and leading as my whole self, was profoundly liberating. I occasionally received updates about Mark through the corporate grapevine. He struggled to find work, the scandal following him like a shadow. David Miller served a short prison sentence and disappeared from the professional world. Their downfall wasn't something I celebrated, but it was a necessary consequence, a clearing away of the rot that had threatened to consume the company I'd built. 6 months after the shareholder meeting, I stood on the newly renovated rooftop terrace of the Innovate Solutions building, hosting a reception for the mentorship program Maya Sharma had inspired, watching young, diverse talent engaging confidently with senior leadership. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the company I had always envisioned. Maya herself, now a senior analyst, approached me. "Ms. Vance," she said, her eyes shining, "thank you. You didn't just change the leadership, you changed the culture. People feel seen here now." That, I realized, was the true victory. It wasn't about exposing Mark or reclaiming my position. It was about creating an environment where competence, integrity, and diverse perspectives could thrive. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever be dismissed as just a pretty face within these walls. The journey from underestimated wife to visible CEO had been unexpected, painful, and ultimately incredibly empowering. Mark's betrayal had been the catalyst, but the transformation was entirely my own. I had stepped out of the shadows, not just to reclaim my company, but to reclaim myself. And in doing so, I discovered that leading with authenticity was the most powerful strategy of all.